He investigates how these conceptualizations have manifested themselves on our ideological and ecological landscapes, while also exploring Black expressive culture as alternative sites of ecological thought and practice. He is the recipient of numerous fellowships and awards, including generous support from the Fulbright Program, the Institute for Citizens and Scholars, and the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation. His current book, titled Inhabitants of the Deep, the Blueness of Blackness, will illuminate abiding relationship between Blackness and the oceanic by undertaking a Black eco-critical study of the trope of water in African diaspora literature. Please give a warm welcome to Dr. Howard.
Can y'all hear me? Is this thing on? This is good? All right. Thank you for that warm welcome. This is a very beautiful building, and I'm happy to be here with you all. There's a lot more faces than I anticipated, and so I'm a little intimidated, but we're gonna be all right. So thank you, Anastasia, for that introduction, that beautiful introduction, and I'm just gonna hop right into it because I tend to be long-winded and I want to be careful about time. And also because I want to be careful about time, I'm gonna mostly read my remarks because I've timed them. And I am more likely to be on time if I just read. So excuse me reading from my remarks. So let's get started. So my talk, can y'all see that? Look at that. For today is the Atlantic opportunity toward the human inhabitant. So as a literary scholar, put this way so I don't get feedback, who is also concerned with environmental crisis, I've made a somewhat dubious decision, not unlike the dubious decision we advise against in that familiar adage, never bring a sword to a gunfight. See, I've brought books to a climate fight, not an instrument to measure the concentration of carbon in or extract carbon from the atmosphere or policy limiting the use of fossil fuels, but books. And with the health of our planet teetering on the razor's edge of a few degrees Celsius, now hardly seems like the time to cozy up with a good book. But consider these words from pioneering eco-critical scholar Lawrence Buell in his path-breaking book, The Environmental Imagination. Quote, if, as environmental philosophers contend, Western metaphysics and ethics need revision before we can address today's environmental problems, then environmental crisis involves a crisis of imagination, the amelioration of which depends on finding better ways of imaging nature and humanity's relation to it, end quote. If, as Buell contends, environmental crisis also involves a crisis of imagination, that is a crisis of how we imagine nature and humanity's relationship to nature, then it seems to me that we had better bring a few books to this climate fight. Since stories, after all, are the province of the imagination. In them, we not only find an archive of how we have poorly imagined the earth and ourselves in relationship to the earth, but also alternative and possibly more ecologically sound images of the same. I arrive at our collective climate fight today armed with two books, Arnold Guyot's The Earth and Man, and Olaudah Equiano's The Interesting Narrative of the Life of Olaudah Equiano. By attending to the images of the human-nature relationship in the stories that both these texts tell about humanity's encounter with a previously unknown ocean, I hope to fight the good fight. In her book, Demonic Grounds, Black feminist geographer Catherine McKittrick contends that, quote, historical epics are underwritten by differential encounters with geography, end quote. Following McKittrick, this talk forwards two primary claims. First, I propose that the historical epic otherwise known as modernity, and more recently dubbed by geologists and climate scientists as the Anthropocene, is underwritten by Europe's and Africa's differential encounters with the Atlantic Ocean throughout the era of New World discovery and colonization. Second, I argue that these differential encounters with the Atlantic Ocean gave rise to two distinct genres of the human, what I propose we might call the stand your ground subjectivity of whiteness on the one hand, and the inhabitation of the deep of blackness on the other. However, before I delineate these two radically divergent interfaces with the planet, let me first begin by framing the general Atlantic opportunity within which these genres of the human emerged. Section 1, the Atlantic opportunity. In the Black Atlantic, Paul Gilroy put forward as a defining archetype of modernity the image of the, quote, ships in motion across the spaces between Europe, America, Africa, and the Caribbean, end quote. Since Gilroy's classic text, the chorus of scholars bearing witness to the historic significance of the transatlantic crossing and precipitating an unprecedentedly modern arrangement of time and space has continued to grow. The historian Stephanie Smallwood, for instance, observes in her book Saltwater Slavery that, quote, for early modern people everywhere in the Atlantic basin, the initial encounter with the Atlantic as an arena for human activity was profoundly transformative, end quote. And in their book, The Birth of African American Culture, anthropologists Sidney Mintz and Richard Price argue that, quote, new world it is. For those who became its peoples, remade it. And in the process, they remade themselves, end quote. But if this interdisciplinary consensus were not already persuasive enough, the hard sciences have also recently joined this chorus with even more grandiose claims about these ships and their impact on not just historical, but geological time. In their book, The Human Planet, How We Created the Anthropocene, climate scientists Mark Maslin and Simon Lewis proposed the transatlantic traffic of the 16th century as the likely origin of a new geological epoch. Quote, in the 16th century, a new planet-wide, human-driven evolutionary experiment began, which will continue to play out indefinitely. What plate tectonics did over tens of millions of years is being undone by shipping in a few centuries and aviation in a few decades. We are creating a new Pangea. This fits one of the hallmarks of a new epoch, as it is geologically significant change to life on Earth. It is an important event in the context of Earth's history, end quote. New world it also is then, insofar as the Atlantic crossings of the 16th century precipitated a new planet-wide human-driven evolutionary experiment, now broadly recognized as the Anthropocene, or the geological age of man. The transatlantic voyages following in the immediate wake of Columbus's discovery of the New World in 1492 initiated a massive biotic exchange between Earth's eastern and western hemispheres, which the historian Alfred Crosby has famously dubbed the Columbian Exchange. Lewis and Maslin, however, further argue that this Columbian exchange also facilitated a global reordering of life on Earth, which is now written indelibly into Earth's fossil record as perhaps the earliest sign of humanity's geological agency. And quickly, I just want to show this image that comes from The Human Planet, which is a digitized image of shipping routes from the 18th and 19th century. And what's powerful about this image is that even without any visual representation of Earth's land masses, Earth's continental land masses, just the shipping routes alone show the outline of Earth's continental land masses, which is sort of why Lewis and Maslin argue that shipping and the combination of aviation give rise to a new Pangea, as they say. The ships in motion across, too early. The ships in motion across the spaces between Europe, America, Africa, and the Caribbean then have not only given rise to the new world or new peoples, but also a new earth. Still, I'd like to propose yet another implication of the Atlantic crossing, one which takes its cue from the musings of a late contemporary of these transatlantic crossings, who recognized in them a significant opportunity. In his famous essay, Walking, an early touchstone of US environmental thought, Henry David Thoreau writes, quote, "The Atlantic is a Lethean stream in our passage over which we have had an opportunity to forget the old world and its institutions. If we do not succeed this time, there is perhaps one more chance for the race left before it arrives on the banks of the Styx, and that is in the Lethe of the Pacific, which is 3 times as wide." Now, I don't know how well caught up you are in your Greek mythology, but the Lethe and the river Lethe and Styx are Greek mythological rivers. The Lethe, when you cross over it into the underworld, causes you to forget everything. And I don't know what the Styx does. I think the Styx is like the last one you cross. I'm not really sure. Clearly, I need to be caught up on my Greek mythology. Following Thoreau, the ships in motion across the Atlantic also occasioned what we might label an Atlantic opportunity. That is, an opportunity, namely, to forget the old world and its institutions. In Walking, the specific institution that concerns Thoreau is the notion of private property and its growing encroachment upon the American wilderness. Beyond merely the negative opportunity to forget, however, I want to propose that within the broader context of Walking, the Atlantic opportunity may also be regarded positively. So the opening sentence of Walking reads like this, quote, "I wish to speak a word for nature, for absolute freedom and wildness, as contrasted with a freedom and culture merely civil, to regard man as an inhabitant or a part and parcel of nature rather than a member of society," end quote. So Thoreau's reflection on the meaning of the Atlantic crossing takes place within the larger context of an attempt to reimagine the human as a genuine inhabitant, right? Part and parcel of, rather than separate from or superior to, nature. Thoreau viewed Europe's Atlantic crossings as a crucial manifestation of what he generally recognized as the, quote, westward tendency of human history. For example, he writes, quote, "Columbus felt the westward tendency more strongly than any before. He obeyed it and found a new world," end quote. And as another example of this westward tendency, Thoreau also cites an extended passage from Arnold Guyot's The Earth and Man, in which the Swedish-American geographer allegorizes human history as the adventurous career westward of a metonymic man of the old world. And we'll return to that allegorization a little bit later, well, soon. Thoreau valorizes the westward tendency of human history because, in his estimation, it served to bring humanity into potentially salutary contact with the wild. He writes, quote, "The West of which I speak is but another name for the wild. And what I have been preparing to say is that in wildness is the preservation of the world. Every tree sends its fibers forth in search of the wild. The cities import it at any price. Men plow and sail for it. From the forest and wilderness come the tonics and barks which brace mankind. Our ancestors were savages. The story of Romulus and Remus being suckled by a wolf is not a meaningless fable. The founders of every state which has risen to eminence have drawn their nourishment and vigor from a similar wild source." This off-cited passage from Thoreau's Walking is the source of what over the years has been adopted by the US environmentalist movement as a kind of mantra. Quote, "In wildness is the preservation of the world." This mantra bespeaks a vision of environmentalism focused primarily on the conservation of the wilderness. By maintaining humanity's interface with the wild, Thoreau contends the westward tendency of human history preserves humanity's prospects of becoming a genuine inhabitant of nature, rather than a member of society alienated from nature. Within this westward tendency, however, notice that Thoreau valorizes the Atlantic crossing only as the negative opportunity to forget the old world and its barriers to genuine inhabitation. The positive opportunity to actually become an inhabitant is relegated instead to a terrestrial encounter with the wilderness. Put another way, the Atlantic crossing can only erase, while the wilderness furnishes the crayon that alone may green the human. Yet what if the preservation of the world is also in the ocean, as perhaps Earth's wildest wild? Indeed, the ocean is not only uniquely resistant to being interpolated as private property, but with its penchant for immersion, it also uniquely forces the issue of becoming part and parcel of nature. Thus, as much as the possible origin of a new geological age marked by environmental crisis, what would it mean to also locate in these same transatlantic crossings the prospects for the emergence of the environmental human? What if the Atlantic opportunity inheres not merely in the negative opportunity to forget, but also the positive opportunity to discover, perhaps for the very first time, the human as the inhabitant of a blue planet? Consider that in the transatlantic voyages that proceeded throughout the transatlantic eras of discovery, colonization, and the slave trade, a critical mass of humanity was encountering the deep sea for the very first time. Although individual groups of humans had explored and even crossed the Atlantic previously, the sustained encounter with the deep sea witnessed during this era was unprecedentedly general. Moreover, because it coincided historically with the discovery of the Western Hemisphere, and so with the earliest possible attempts to define the species and the planet as genuine totalities for anyone compelled to undertake such a project, this transatlantic era indexed a truly species-wide opportunity to question just what sort of planet the Earth is, and by extension, what sort of creature the human is in relation to the Earth. If we are to appraise this Atlantic opportunity thoroughly, however, we will need to look where Thoreau did not know or think to, not least because the Atlantic opportunity already seemed in doubt for Thoreau, so far as the European passages that he primarily had in view, so much so that he had already begun to look toward the second chance of the Pacific, 3 times as wide. However, Europe's were not the only passages across the Atlantic. There were also the involuntary passages of those who endured the crossing from the holds rather than the decks of these ships. With an eye toward these opposing crossings, the remainder of my talk will undertake a comparative analysis of Europe's and Africa's uneven encounters with the Atlantic Ocean. Yes. Europe and Africa may not have been the only ones to make this journey, but they do warrant distinction as the Romulus and Uncle Remus of the transatlantic crossing, and the ocean as the wolf that suckled both, though our Remus jumped ship and not a wall when he met his fratricidal fate. 2. Race and nature. Continuing from our outline of the Atlantic opportunity, which again, to reiterate, I propose we might understand as the opportunity to discover the human as the inhabitant of a blue planet, I want to advance a second related claim about the Atlantic crossing, namely that Europe's and Africa's uneven encounters with the Atlantic also function to produce the racial constructions otherwise known as whiteness and blackness. We find precedent for such an understanding of the Atlantic crossing in the path-breaking book Race and Nature, where eco-critical scholar Paul Autke argues that the construction of whiteness and blackness, quote, occurred not simply in a negotiation internal to themselves, but through reference to a third term, nature, a larger context that grounded literally both, while continuously enacting its own disappearance into the literal background. And not only did nature provide a critically important origin for the production of an essential blackness and a largely invisible whiteness, the naturalization of race allowed race and racial hierarchy to piggyback on a pre-existing and absolute human natural hierarchy in a way eco-critics are only beginning to consider. In other words, what Black studies critiques as the color line, separating whiteness and blackness, and what the environmental humanities critiques as the binary between humanity and nature are not two different, but one single line, with the color line piggybacking on the pre-existing hierarchical logic of the human nature binary. Hence, the principal justification for racial slavery, the idea that Africans were not human, was also the principal justification for the degradation of the environment. Building on Alka's illumination of the profound entanglement of race and nature, however, I want to propose that the first natural context, which served to ground whiteness and blackness in the way that he describes, was not ground at all, but the ocean. To demonstrate this claim, I'd like to turn to an examination of Europe's and Africa's uneven encounters with the Atlantic Ocean as they are represented in Arnold Guyot's 19th century treatise on geography, The Earth and Man, and Olaudah Equiano's 18th century slave narrative, The Interesting Narrative of the Life of Olaudah Equiano, respectively, and trace in the representation of these opposing Atlantic crossings the construction of whiteness on the one hand as stand your ground subjectivity, and blackness on the other as inhabitation of the deep. 3, whiteness as stand your ground subjectivity. For the Europeans encountering the deep sea for the very first time during the age of discovery and colonization, the seemingly infinite expanse of the ocean presented a kind of gut check. Notice how Guyot's man of the old world, who Thoreau cites in Walking as an exemplar of humanity's westward tendency, stumbles upon reaching the Atlantic. Quote, "The man of the old world sets out upon his way. Leaving the highlands of Asia, he descends from station to station towards Europe. Each of his steps is marked by a new civilization superior to the preceding, by a greater power of development. Arrived at the Atlantic, he pauses on the shore of this unknown ocean, the bounds of which he knows not, and turns upon his footprints for an instant." End quote. So a conspicuous pause worries the middle of what Guyot otherwise depicts in the heroic metonym of the Old World man as the seamless westward march of European civilization. But for this pause, the Old World man's adventurous career westward proceeds as an unbroken vector of linear progress, in which a hierarchical capacity for civilization is performed through the engine of bipedalism, such that one linchpin of human being, the capacity to walk on 2 feet, symbolizes another, the capacity for civilization. Nevertheless, this proud and species-defining gait, measuring new and superior civilizations with every stride, falters conspicuously at the Atlantic. This stumble arguably registers the fear and anxiety that generally characterize Europe's first contact with what Guyot characterizes as a previously unknown and dreaded ocean, but in a way that mirrors Europe's historically novel encounter with the Atlantic, not as a coastal sea, but an unbounded deep. The ambulatory powers of the Old World man accordingly falter, not merely at an unknown ocean, but more specifically an ocean whose bounds are unknown. It is specifically the landless realm of the deep sea. It is specifically by the landless realm of the deep sea that he is undone. Indeed, in the imagination of the early modern humans encountering this face of the earth for the very first time, the deep presented a space that was no less extraterrestrial than outer space. So alien and strange were these waters without a shore, and so precarious and uncertain these first voyages into its untested abyss. Face to face with this astonishingly unearthly realm, the Old World man not only stops in his tracks, but turns upon his footprints and retreats back to dry land. But you can't keep an old world man down. Rather, after what Guyot describes as a long and teeming repose, he returns somehow newly empowered by the genius of the age to attack and subdue the ocean into the gentle servant of his colonial desire. Quote, then recommences his adventurous career westward as in the earliest ages. Under the guidance of the genius of the age, he attacks this dreaded ocean, of which to this time he knows only the margin. He abandons himself to the winds and the currents, which bear him gently towards the coasts of America. What changed, we might ask, to embolden the old world man to attack the ocean he first feared? After being so thoroughly undone by the deep, how do we account for what Guyot describes as the reanimation facilitated by his long and teeming repose? And how might this reanimation bespeak a broader reanimation in this transatlantic moment of Europe's understanding of the earth and man, as Guyot would have it? Even before examining more closely the contents of this long and teeming repose, perhaps one answer lies in the fact that after he turns upon his footprints, there is no actual mention of the old world man ever fully turning back around. In his rematch with the deep, he appears not to face the ocean so much as back into it. If you look closely, the footprints that lead up to the threshold of the Atlantic and spawn Europe's colonization of the New World proceed heel first. In a poor rendition of the moonwalk, the souls of white folk proceed backward, heading west, but facing east. Never turning around to genuinely confront the ocean, the old world man seems to revive his confidence to resume his adventurous career westward by decisively reorienting himself toward the land. He gathers the strength to re-enter the sea by fixating on terra firma, suppressing his dread by sustaining even at sea a hallucination of dry land. And we learn from Smallwood that in his bad faith encounter with the ocean, the old world man is very much a faithful metonym for Europe's transatlantic passages. In her book, Saltwater Slavery, she explains, quote, by the time Europeans began to colonize the New World, voyagers to the West were confident that their journeys would follow a linear path with known beginning and endpoints. European seamen translated the land-based systems of time-space reckoning of medieval Europe to the wider temporal and spatial context of life in a new Atlantic world. Hourglasses and astrolabes measured time and space, and applied mathematics and geometry turned these into the Cartesian coordinates seamen used to recognize place in a seemingly formless arena of the sea. End quote. So in other words, Europeans made the unknown ocean of the Atlantic knowable in terms of land. Aided by land-based systems of time-space reckoning, whatever interruption was posed by the deep was sufficiently mitigated by the technology of the ship, which even at sea sustained an experience of Earth as little more than a docile surface. Hence, in a letter attempting to assuage his family's fears about the dangers of the transatlantic journey, a European settler likened a ship at sea to, quote, a cradle rocked by a careful mother's hand, which though it be moved up and down, is not in danger of falling, end quote. Indeed, for the European, the ship was, or at least aspired to be, land at sea. Closer examination of the old world man's long and teeming repose suggests that his unrepentant footprint embodies a decisive reorientation not only to land, but more specifically to the land practice incubated during his inland retreat, which is said to be spent under the influence of the soil of Europe. Quote, under the influence of the soil of Europe, so richly organized, he works out slowly the numerous germs wherewith he is endowed. After this long and teeming repose, his faculties are reawakened. He is reanimated. At the close of the 15th century, an unaccustomed movement agitates and vexes him from one end of the continent to the other. He has tilled the impoverished soil, and yet the number of his offspring increases. He turns his looks at once towards the east and the west and sets out in search of new countries. His horizon enlarges, his activity preys upon him, he breaks his bounds, end quote. A far cry from Thoreau's wild. According to Guyot, the richness of Europe's soil inheres not in the soil itself, which is actually described as impoverished, but specifically in its organization. In other words, Guyot invokes Europe's soil not as a surface possessing its own value, but as an interface. That is the site of an idealized relationship between the earth and man. The land enclosures, which had begun in England by the 16th century, helped bring specificity to the nature of this idealized interface by illuminating just how Europe's soil was coming to be organized during this period. In The Human Planet, Lewis and Maslin explained that, quote, by the 16th century, the first enclosures, were occurring in England, driving commoners off communal land to give landlords the exclusive use of it for increasingly lucrative sheep farming. Every piece of land was coming to be privately owned, with one person owning exclusive rights to it, turning the whole earth into private property, just as we think of it today. To be under the influence of the soil of Europe, then, is moreover to be under the influence of the specific mode of relating to land as private property. Significantly, this specific human planetary interface is also explicitly racialized by Guyot in the justification he offers for Europe's expropriation of indigenous land. In a familiar rehearsing of white settler colonial ideology, he reasons that, quote, America is made for the man of the old world because, quote, the human race of the new world, the Indian, had otherwise failed to open the soil with his plowshares, to demand the treasures it encloses, and work out all the wealth of its inexhaustible fertility, end quote. This distinction in land practice and use further maps onto the racist distinction Guyot establishes between the agricultural white race as, quote, the most perfect type of humanity, and the, quote, copper-colored hunting tribes of the two Americas, end quote. We know that American Indians had robust agricultural practices, and that their reduction here to mere hunters is a common ideological screen for expropriation and colonization. Nevertheless, it is significant to note how, in racial distinction to the supposedly inferior Indian, the whiteness of the white race inheres as much in a normative way of relating to the land as in skin color. The whiteness of European settlers is embodied in an exclusionary and extractive land practice that doubled as a litmus test for true humanity. Once the old world man reaches the coasts of America, his impressive stride decelerates into an even greater triumph of standing. First, he treads the shore of this land of wonders. Then he establishes himself little by little upon this new land, before ultimately he gets a foothold. Thus, at the historical moment when humanity might have otherwise discovered itself through its historic encounter with the deep to be hopelessly immersed in nature, the species, as reflected in the metonymic hero of the old world man, is reanimated instead as a kind of stand your ground subject, whose primary interface with the planet is that of the foothold of private property. Embodied first in the unrepentant footprint and ultimately in the colonial foothold of the old world man were, thus, a set of decisions about the identity of the earth and man, which were poised to go out into the world through the historical unfolding of white settler colonialism. The decision first in the turn away from the ocean, and with it, any experience of the earth beyond that of a docile surface, and again in the old world man's foothold, that earth is little more than a docile surface to be either extracted or possessed. And the decision too, that man is the entitled ruler and owner of that surface, that the life of man is ideally expressed not as inhabitation or, God forbid, immersion, but rather separation from nature. These were the decisions which were poised to go out into the world, already exhibiting what we readily recognize today in Guyot's mention of Europe's exhausted soil and increasing number of offspring as two classic signs of ecological crisis: soil exhaustion and overpopulation. And crucially, these decisions about the nature of the earth and man announced themselves to the world as whiteness. 4, this is my last section. Blackness as inhabitation of the deep. So Europe was not the only Atlantic opportunity, however. Over the course of the near 400-year tenure of the transatlantic slave trade, enslaved Africans also encountered this previously unknown ocean, albeit under dramatically different circumstances. According to Smallwood, quote, enslaved Africans entered the Atlantic without the information and background that enabled their European captors to navigate the open sea. When confronted with the phenomenon, African captives responded to the Atlantic as Europeans had done. They made it knowable in their own terms. But the condition of their Atlantic experience shaped that process, just as the particular conditions of maritime exploration had shaped the integration of the Atlantic into European culture and consciousness, end quote. Considering that the surface of our planet is more than 2/3 ocean, the stakes of its integration into culture and consciousness are nothing short of humanity's knowledge of the earth and, what's more, itself in relation to the earth. If for Europe, this process could be recognized, at least as represented in the adventurous career westward of the Old World man, to yield a sense of the earth as little more than a docile surface, and a vision of humanity as a stand your ground subject, what alternative visions of the earth and the human might the Black maritime experience of Middle Passage yield? As an alternative to Europe's Atlantic crossing, then, perhaps a more promising place to begin to reimagine man as an inhabitant, or a part and parcel of nature, to recall Thoreau's language, are the Middle Passages of those the former slave Olaudah Equiano described in his 18th century slave narrative as the inhabitants of the deep, since they, in a way better proportioned to the material composition of our blue planet, assume the ocean and not the land. I always hate when YouTube videos end and it's just wild shit, just this, that you have no control over. Since they, in a way better proportioned to the material composition of our blue planet, assume the ocean and not the land, and still less private property as ground zero for social and ecological thought. The historiography of the transatlantic slave trade teaches us that most of the captives gathered before the Atlantic on the west coast of Africa, poised to board slave ships as modernity's cargo, were encountering the ocean for the very first time. This blue expanse stretched now unendingly before them in a geographic harangue of landlessness, the planet's conspicuous failure to resolve back into terra firma, as water was apt to do in the rivers and lakes that served as their closest aquatic reference. Having never before seen any water larger than a pond or river, Equiano recounts his dramatic first encounter with the ocean in this way. The first object which saluted my eyes when I arrived on the coast was the sea, and a slave ship, which was then riding at anchor and waiting for its cargo. These filled me with astonishment, which was soon converted into terror when I was carried on board. End quote. Equiano's astonishment would have been typical of pre-colonial West African societies for whom Smallwood tells us, quote, the landless realm of the deep ocean did not figure as a domain of human as opposed to divine activity. Thus, Smallwood explains that for middle passing Africans, quote, the slave ship was not just a setting for brutality and death, but also a locus of unparalleled displacement. As the sight of land grew faint, or as the land disappeared suddenly on the closing of the hatch, the disorientation that for many had begun with the process of procurement on the African coast became more marked. Out of sight of any land, enslaved Africans commenced a march through time and space that stretched their own systems of reckoning to the limits. The renowned Black American author Zora Neale Hurston captures this unparalleled displacement in her book Barracoon, which recounts the story of Cujo Lewis, the last known living survivor of Middle Passage in the United States. In the interviews Hurston conducted with Lewis, years later, he could still recall the visual freefall that he and his shipmates experienced once all sight of land vanished from the horizon. Quote, we looky and looky and looky and looky, and we don't see nothing but water. Where we come from, we don't know. Where we going, we don't know. In the oft-cited first chapter of Poetics of Relation, Edward Glissant approximates the terrible wonder of this experience by performing a haunting act of ventriloquy. The words may be his, but they sound out questions that, in their unmoored suspense, seem to emerge from the veritable mouths of the Africans hovering over the face of the deep. Quote, what kind of river has no middle? Is nothing there but straight ahead? With these words, Glissant imagines the sea-legged questions that middle-passing Africans must have asked of the planet while huddled in the holds of slave ships. Brought forth in an anguished naivete, they impersonate the uncertainty of those who, confronted with nothing but straight ahead, could not be certain of the land's eventual return. For who was there who cared to stop and explain, in a language they could understand, arrival, that they were headed someplace other than the eternal now of the Atlantic? These unique circumstances meant that Middle Passage was for many of the enslaved not a crossing, which implies eventual arrival, but an extended, suspended, arrested departure. The name Middle Passage is both ironic and anachronistic in this respect, for it grants knowledge of arrival where there was none, either for those who foundered in the Atlantic along the way, or for those who did arrive on the shores of the New World, but could not have known that they would. Thus, Middle Passage required African captives to perform a terrific feat of imagination, suddenly displaced from any and all signs of land, and neither being assured of reaching some future elsewhere beyond the Atlantic. Theirs was the historical labor of having to make a ground out of no ground, of having to imagine and improvise a human life lived absolutely at sea, without even the faintest relief of a future promised land. Which is to say that for the 3 weeks or so that it took a ship on average to cross the Atlantic, enslaved Africans rehearsed and practiced an unstable occupation and precarious negotiation of space that, because they could not be certain it would ever end, came to be conflated in their minds with the undertaking of living, with life. Thus, to speak of middle-passing Africans is to speak precisely of those who were without the middle. Belied in what we call Middle Passage is a lived experience whose predicament and passion are perhaps better and more faithfully apprehended as an inhabitation of the deep. I borrow this phrase from Equiano's seeming misnaming of those who, preferring death to the horrors of enslavement, jumped overboard during the Middle Passage. Of these persons, he observes, quote, often did I think many of the inhabitants of the deep much more happy than myself. I envied them the freedom they enjoyed, and as often wish I could exchange my condition for theirs. Why does Equiano use inhabitants, a word typically reserved for the living, to describe those who jumped to their deaths? Moreover, how can he possibly claim to envy these drowned slaves their freedom? Yet, if we suspend our initial objections to Equiano's apparent misnaming of the drowned and take seriously the lives that were lived underwater, awfully abbreviated as they were, then perhaps what emerges is an ecological recalibration of human life and freedom on a blue planet. If, in the colonial foothold of the Old World man, we witness the production of whiteness as stand your ground subjectivity, in the steps that middle passing Africans blinked on the surface of the Atlantic, we alternatively witness the production of blackness as an inhabitation of the deep. Crucially, however, what Glissant's questions hold out to us is that all middle passing Africans, and not just those who jumped or were thrown overboard, were inhabitants of the deep, insofar as they all weighed the prospect of a human life lived absolutely at sea. And it's here, I propose, that we might be better served searching for the human ecological life after which Thoreau groped when he endeavored to speak a word for man as an inhabitant, or part and parcel of nature. The inhabitants of the deep yield precisely such an inhabitant, as it would need to be imagined on a planet that, as it happens, is significantly more deep than terra firma. And faced with a changing climate and rising sea levels, who knows but that at these deepest depths, the inhabitants of the deep speak for all of us, asking their blue questions, inaugurating the ecological life of the earthling. Thank you.
All right. Thank you so much, Dr. Howard. We're going to get started with some questions from the audience. If anyone has a question, please raise your hand. I can't. Am I? See. Oh.
Looks like we got one here up front.
Thank you so much. This talk was fascinating and super exciting to hear from the environmental humanities, which is, I think, something often missing or maybe underspoken. So thank you, first of all. My question is about kind of in this field, I guess about kind of your journey in the environmental humanities. And you mentioned a little bit about this at the beginning of your talk, but coming into this field, how do you talk with literary scholars about these subjects who maybe not be who might not be inclined to kind of think environmentally? And by contrast, how do you kind of speak to or recommend kind of speaking to policymakers, scientists who might not be appreciating the way that literature can help us answer these kinds of questions? Thank you.
Yeah. I think like a wrinkle to your question, since I'm both in literary studies and in African American studies, is how do I also talk to my colleagues in African American studies about the environment who may or may not be inclined to think environmentally? How do I do that? I don't know, by being persistent, maybe, yelling. But I honestly, what I do in the context of literature, like we're so persuaded of the significance of stories, all kinds of story. And so it's a natural leap to then pay attention to the stories we tell about the natural environment, right? So folks actually get down with that pretty easily. They don't have trouble with it. In Black studies, there's a little bit of a reticence at times because a site of trauma in Black studies has been the identification of Black life as non-human. And so exploring any sort of generative association between Blackness and nature, given that traumatic history, is sometimes a bit dicey, right? So if you have, like, if you're analyzing a slave narrative, like Narrative of Life of Frederick Douglass, where he's given an account of this really traumatic event where he's, up for auction beside other, domesticated animals, and that's like the site of his trauma, he's not being treated like a human. It can be hard to, in a room of Black studies folks, sometimes to be like, oh, we might actually want to pause here though and think about what it might mean to, like, as a pathway of liberation, to embrace, to be open to an identification with the non-human, right? Or to break down the barrier of between humanity and nature, right? To not pursue some sort of notion of humanity that is predicated upon the exclusion of the degradation of the natural environment. Likewise, I think on the other end, it's actually much harder, I think, to talk to environmental humanities folks or environmental studies folks sometimes about race. That is significantly harder. Mostly because it's just considered, I think less so now, like this is less of a problem now, but definitely when I first started, it was like, well, what does this have to do? What does race have to do with nature? That's obvious to a Black studies person. It's like less obvious, as it can be less obvious sometimes to certain groups of crowds of environmental studies folks. Yeah. Thanks for your question. It was a good one.
All right, I think we have time for one more.
Thank you so much for your talk. I have a question. It might be kind of unfair, but a question nonetheless, in case you have thoughts. It's interesting to think through literature as a way to understand like how we relate to nature and different components of nature. In this example, the sea, the ocean. And I know that like a lot of what you were examining starts with like the slave trade and onwards. But I'm curious to the extent that you are aware of or know of literature or storytelling from like from Africa around their like the pre-slave trade relationship with the ocean. And are there lessons there that we can take in terms of ocean stewardship and that we should readopt now, and things that were lost when they crossed River Leith?
Yeah. So that's a fascinating question, not at all unfair. And what I would say is two things. There's like an amazing book by a historian named Kevin Dawson called, it's a history of West African aquatic culture, right? And the main argument of the book is that like an in-depth experience of and culture built around waterways in general and the ocean in particular is not brand new to Africa, right? And predates European contact. Now, when it comes to part of the reason why I focus on Middle Passage is I'm specifically interested in the deep sea. So not just like the coastal ocean, but like experience of the deep sea. And that's where like there's certainly space and room for the ocean in African cosmologies, and one way to get at that would be the religious traditions, right? Either Ifa or like Yoruba religious traditions, which have concepts of the ocean, different divine entities that are associated with the ocean. But what's interesting is that if you like study those religious cultures, there are certain shifts that happen when those religions are recreated in a New World context. And one of the shifts is that there was no cosmology for the deep sea. And after the Middle Passage, there's like a reinvention of these cosmologies that accounts for the deep sea, where suddenly now we have names for like, well, like one particular goddess, like her name's Yemanja. She's the goddess of the sea in the New World context. But in the Old World, or like in Africa, she's the goddess associated with a specific river, right? So she gets recast from freshwater to saltwater. And part of what folks hypothesize is like, well, in the wake of Middle Passage, there is this need to cosmologically account for the deep sea. So what I would say is that it would be a mistake to think that African cosmologies have no concept of the ocean. And there is something unprecedented or new about the experience of the deep sea that Middle Passage brought. Yeah.
All right, well, thank you so much. Let's give one last one.
Thank you.